Hello everyone, welcome to City University London. This is the event that we organized for International Open Access Week. We've been trying to get Cameron to visit City for a while. He's one of the busiest men in the business. And it's just such a privilege to have you here, and it's a privilege to have you here too. So thanks very much. This is an institution that is happy to establish links with the community, more than happy. We're very proud to be here in this part of London town. And Cameron came down to London to talk to us. I feel very privileged. We are trying to stream this. We don't know if online. We don't know if it will work because we don't have. Well, I don't have proper equipment. I think we'll be in charge of trying to record it properly to share later. The slides are Creative Commons licensed attributions. They will be shared later as well online. And we'll try to share the audio and the video later, and the text as well. Mm-hmm. But we have the privilege of presence, right? That's still something that we haven't managed to completely to replace with digital data. So thank you very much for coming here. We'll have an opportunity to discuss after the presentation, to debate ideas, and to have a glass of wine and celebrate openness. Cameron, as you know, so if you are here is because we know who he is. You will find more about him on his website, Science in the Open. He is on Twitter as Cameron Neylon. He is an advocate for open science, open research, open access publishing. I think there's only a bunch of other people who have the experience that he has. I probably need to do something here. Sorry about that. So, Cameron, this is our audience today, our colleagues and friends, students, and it's a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you very much. This is Cameron Neylon with the Limits of Open. Thank you, Cameron.
Thanks, Ernesto. And it's actually a real privilege to be here, and thank you all for coming out. It's the middle of the week, and it's after work or after classes, and it's not always easy to make the time. This is a departure for me. I've recently moved, my background is in the sciences, but I've moved into recently humanities position. So this is really, in a sense, my first attempt to pull a bunch of ideas together. So you're kind of the first people getting it. And I'm interested in your take, because I think it's important that we rethink some aspects of how we approach these issues around openness, open access, open data, in the light of the experiences we've had in implementation. So this is the 8th year of Open Access Week. I actually used to work with the people who started Open Access Week. If you're ever interested in knowing why Open Access Week and Open Access is orange, it's because they looked out the window of the office and saw the San Francisco Giants stadium. So it made massive progress, huge progress towards open access, particularly in this country, but also open access to data, to educational resources increasingly, and to many aspects of the sort of knowledge economy that we're creating. The technology landscape has shifted, and shifted massively. The assessment landscape, particularly in this country, has shifted, and that makes a big difference. And obviously, the policy landscape has shifted quite a lot. And yet, I think we're amongst friends here. It's okay to express a few misgivings about where we are. It's taken longer, and it's been harder than many of us expected. I guess I've been in this game for around about a decade. Many other people from the mid and early 90s have been working on open access for getting on for 25 years, and it's certainly been harder than they expected. And of course, we've learned over the time, and we've internalised this bitter lesson that cultural change is difficult. Social change is a difficult thing to achieve. And we've learned that, and we keep saying that, and that's fine. But that, I don't think, is actually my biggest concern. My biggest concern is that as the balance is tipping, as we're shifting from this closed world to an open world, something's actually becoming really easy. the momentum that is being picked up has become easy for various players to subvert and shift into the streams they're interested in. For well-resourced players to swoop in and take advantage of these shifts. For the incumbent players to protect their margins, protect their markets, and protect their interests. And to prevent some of the innovative new players from being able to take the place that they might be able to and the disruption that they might cause. And yet at the same time, while we often cheer on those small, innovative players, we become less enamoured of them as they start to grow and as they start to look more like those traditional incumbent players or get bought by them, as the case may be. So my claim, what I'm going to try and convince you of, is that we can understand what's happening and the way we're thinking about this through a shift in the way we think about the processes involved. For me, open access was never the end. It was part of the process of trying to get to a different goal, which was openness and effectiveness of scholarship and engagement and diversity in scholarship. And that end called various things. Open knowledge is one, a scholarly commons, a knowledge commons. It's a concept which is kind of half socialist, half techno-utopian, half neoliberal, and therefore quite a large idea. But an idea that shared resources can, in some sense, provide a more effective base for value creation. That the sharing economy of Uber and Airbnb could coexist and indeed would reinforce some sort of shared knowledge commons and knowledge space, and that the underexploited capital could work hand in hand with Clay Shirky's cognitive surplus to not just create value in economic terms and improve the structure and scale of markets, but to actually make the world a better place at the same time. The dream that somehow we were going to connect the market orientation with communitarianism to create a better world. And so central to this idea is the concept that knowledge is a public good. And it's important for me to pin down exactly what I mean by that, because it's central to the argument I'm trying to make. So, Eleanor Ostrom, in her book Governing the Commons, divides goods of different types on the basis of two axes. And you can tell this is social sciences because there's a quadrant diagram. Always quadrant diagrams in social sciences. So the first axis is whether goods are rivalrous or non-rivalrous. An apple, or if you prefer at this time of day, a chocolate bar, is rivalrous. If I give it to you, I can no longer eat it, unless you give it back to me. The flame of a candle is non-rivalrous. If I light the end of your candle, then we both have a candle with flame lit. And this was the analogy that Jefferson used for knowledge. And then the other axis is excludable and non-excludable. So how easy is it to prevent someone from using some sort of good? I can lock a book in a room and prevent you from having access to it. I can't very easily stop you from breathing the air around us. So that's an important distinction. And once you divide the world by those two axes, you have private goods which are rivalrous and excludable, things like money, food, your home, to a certain extent. And public goods up in the top right, which are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Things like the air, like public libraries, roads, are some of the standard examples. And so natural incentives, like natural as in scare quotes, exist to create these private goods. The acquisitiveness of human beings, and Hirschman talks really interestingly about this in his book about some of the early arguments around capitalism in the 17th century. There's a drive to create these and accumulate these. This happens in a market economy. Public goods, I might turn the volume down. I think it's this one. No, I don't know what it is. Someone's got something. Public goods are a problem. Public goods are a problem because they are of great value. They're useful for a community to have, but because you can't exclude anyone from using them, you have a freeloader problem. And it's too easy for people not to contribute to their creation because someone else will and then you can use them. And so the problem of provisioning public goods is one that has to be solved largely by governments using things like legislation, mandates, public taxation, public infrastructures, and taxpayer-funded infrastructures. The wearing of seatbelts is a public good, the provision of courts is a public good, and the creation of those requires generally central funding, taxpayer funding, and elements of compulsion to make it work. And so it's natural we tend to think of knowledge as a public good. It's infinitely shareable, and once you have it, it's very difficult for me to take it back. So it follows that creating and sharing knowledge is a public good provision problem. And so in the case of trying to make knowledge a public good, we use things like mandates and taxpayer-funded infrastructures. We've actually created an entire rhetoric in the open access movement that is built on the idea of taxpayer access to taxpayer-funded research. It's a rhetoric of nationalisation, which is successful and has worked. But I think it's led us into some problems. So, in that sense, we're done, okay? So we've solved the problem. We've created the legislation, the mandates are in place. Everyone's happy, right? Haven't heard any complaints about open access mandates or open data mandates or anything like that. And yet, and we also feel quite queasy. Why do we feel concerned when Springer moves into open access, when academia.edu starts to hoover up the space that was supposed to be looked after by institutional repositories, when Mendeley is purchased by Elsevier? If we follow the argument of nationalisation, the government has signalled that the system has to change, and the incumbent players have changed from a business of content provision to following the money and providing services. So we can quibble about the costs and how high or low they should be, but the fundamentals are surely in the right place. And yet, there's something that doesn't feel quite right about this. There was more than an issue of liberating knowledge from a private good to a public good. There is an issue of control and who is running the system, an issue of governance, a sense that service provision should actually align with the interests of the community and the values of the scholarly community. But it's not clear what that would look like. It's not even clear that we have shared values as a scholarly community. And so I want to look at the roots of our culture, because as advocates of a technically enabled future, the fact that the web has enabled open access, we often talk about this cultural change, this necessary cultural change, as though it's a new thing. But more often than not, what looks like it is new has really quite deep roots. And more and more often to me, it feels like actually what we need is a return to our past values. So my background is in the sciences. My cultural roots reach very strongly back to the mid-17th century, the creation of the Royal Society in this country, and in particular, the writing of Robert Boyle. And what's interesting about Boyle's writing is that he focuses very strongly on questions of detailed reporting, on the communication of failed experiments and negative results, sharing of data and reproducibility. And these are actually, once you get past the language, startlingly modern concerns. Change the way this is expressed, and it could come out of a graduate textbook, a graduate training manual today. But this focus of history has actually been really interesting this year, as we are on the 350th anniversary of the first publication of Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. And that focus has very much been on the creation of the journal as a sort of creation myth of the scholarly communications. But to me, actually, the journal was just one of several means to an end. The key to the culture that was created at this point in time was this idea of effective communication, of speaking clearly. So to me, our origin myth should actually focus, and our expression of values should actually focus on this goal of communication, not merely on the vessel, which was one of the ones that was created at the time. But that's my culture as a scientist. my roots in science. I first found this quote in Chapman and Schaefer's book, The Leviathan and the Air Pump, a text that arguably was a significant contributor to the science wars, the battle between the objectivists and the science community and the postmodernists in parts of the humanities. And the book, which famously ends that Boyle was wrong and Hobbes was right. So I'm making claims about scholarly values, but are the humanities different? And I've been criticised plenty of times as an open access advocate for not understanding the humanities, and yet I now live in my current job actually in the humanities department, in fact in the Department of Cultural Studies, about as far into the postmodern social constructivist humanities as you can possibly get. So I'm not sure what that means my opinion carries more weight or less weight, but I've actually come to the conclusion there's actually much more in common across scholarship than there is dividing us. And I mean that right across the humanities and the sciences, natural, social, and human. And what unites us is a rhetorical approach to argument. An idea that the way in which we communicate is to pose an argument supported by evidence, processed by methods that are accepted within a specific community. And what counts as evidence and what methods are used differs across communities and differs very strongly. But it turns out that the rhetorical structure of those arguments is actually very similar. Anita Devard points out that bioscience articles pretty much across the board follow an almost identical rhetorical structure to that of fairy tales. And although I haven't done the same level of close reading, it seems to me that that kind of approach spreads right across the humanities. The length of the argument might be different. What counts as evidence and how it's handled might be different. But that overall structure of introduction, once upon a time, something happened, evidence, analysis, conclusions, is very, very consistent. And actually, I don't know enough of the history of early modern scholarship to pin this down, but actually it's interesting, Boyle didn't use that kind of structure very much. And it seems as though what we would now call the sciences adopted that storytelling approach, possibly from what we would now call the humanities, sometime between the mid-17th and early 19th century. But regardless of that, we share some ideals, and Boyle certainly shared some ideals, in the idea that it is review and criticism and the constructive argument about ideas and arguments and not attacking the person that seems to be a core to the way we would like to think peer review should operate today. So I've gone from open knowledge to peer review and public goods to review by peers, which is almost by definition a sort of an exclusive club with rules of admittance, rules of engagement. But while an overall commitment to structured argument might be general, as I said, the question of what evidence is allowed, what is an allowed approach differs between communities. There's an element of circularity here that no amount of open access is ever going to solve. The people who can judge the qualities of a piece of research or scholarship are those that can understand it enough and are those that are peers. General understanding is hard enough to achieve across some pretty similar disciplines even in the natural sciences. Certainly between synthetic chemistry and physical chemistry, there's enough of a gulf without trying to bridge the gap between the humanities and the sciences. There's definitely a disciplinary clubbishness which tends to exclude outsiders, whether they are other professional scholars or students or that other amorphous blob that we refer to as the public. And that clubbishness goes back to Boyle. It goes back to the Royal Society and earlier. The original membership of the Royal Society was limited to 50 people, precisely so they could all stand and sit and argue in the same room, collectively. They could act as real peers in observing and criticising experiments, and that many of them were peers also in the aristocratic sense is a product of the time. But it's a product that was important in the ability of that group to take a political action and to situate natural philosophy and the sciences, or we now call the sciences, as a powerful political force in the early modern world. It was successful precisely because it was a club. And it was a club made up of mostly wealthy white men. I say mostly only because some of them actually had to work for it. So Ostrom's work shows us that group size and homogeneity are two of the most important characteristics in solving collective action problems. So it shouldn't be a surprise that many of the historically most successful groups in determining our modern culture were homogeneous and relatively small. That universities grew out of clerical establishments and that some disciplines still seem to think that they're a priesthood is not surprising. But it doesn't sit well with our modern ideas about diversity and inclusion, and it doesn't seem to sit well with the idea of knowledge as a public and therefore universal good. Because membership in these clubs doesn't need to be exclusive, but even in the most open of possible worlds, access to understanding, access to respect, and the criticism of peers requires work and arguably years of dedication. It's the tension between the idea that access to understanding has to be worked for and the desire for universal access to the fruits of knowledge that underlies the kind of mutual incomprehension that splits Robin Osborne, Professor of History at Cambridge University, and his argument that open access can't possibly make any sense, and the views of open access advocates that closed access can't possibly make sense. Osborne's view is that only those that have been formally trained, that have dedicated a substantial period of their life, can possibly understand the products of scholarship in his space. The naive open access idealist assumes that everyone can understand. And both are wrong. The extreme position is almost always wrong. The gap has to be filled by understanding who can understand what and when, and what forms of access they have, and how those benefits can be maximised. Osborne's right in diagnosing the problem that if we are to expand access, we need to invest in that process. And that investment needs to be made where it could have the most benefit. And we should be thoughtful about where that investment gets made. But if we frame it as an investment, then the resources required in communicating historical research to historians is obvious. The benefits are clear. Further investment, additional investment in making that more accessible to other people outside of that club is a harder case to make. It's risky. It's not clear what the benefits will be. It's not clear that it's the best use of limited available resources. I think there's a strong case to be made that it's worth the risk for reasons that have been discussed many times in open access weeks and open access talks all over the place. But actually what I want to focus on is the risk to disciplines of not engaging with that agenda. What does it mean when a discipline closes down and doesn't believe that it has value to the outside world or that value can be added back to it? So I want to take a step sideways at this point because I want to talk about culture and I want to situate it in a particular kind of way. Usually when we think about culture, and I hope there aren't too many cultural studies people in the room because this is the naive version. We would think about a group of individuals coming together with a common purpose and that what they do, how they act and how they interact co-creates culture that we can see and understand and study in some form. John Hartley and Jason Potts, in their book Cultural Science, argue that what's actually happening is almost the exact opposite. That actually what's happening is that culture creates groups. Those groups tell themselves a story of who they are and what they're doing and how they act. And that story reflects and creates and recreates the culture. So the culture is in the language forms the group identifies through the language and the narratives and the stories, and that then becomes the culture over time. They describe this as an evolutionary theory, and that's an important point, one in which there are elements of culture that are under selection. And the words they use, which threw me for a long time, is shared units of meaningfulness. And then there's one of those typical humanistic steps. They say meaningfulness has the same relationship to meaning as truthfulness does to truth, which really didn't help me very much. But something fell in place for me actually last week. I was at a workshop with Martin Eve, Damien Patterson, Samuel Moore and Daniel O'Donnell, people I'm sure many of you know. We're trying to tease apart the language we use when we talk about excellence and excellent research and the quality of research and how that varies across disciplinary boundaries. And what struck me was that our shared or not shared conceptions of excellence are a form of language, a strong determinant of disciplinary boundaries. So whether or not you agree that Herrnstein-Smith's or McClintock's or Ostrom's or Moses' work is excellent, indeed whether you recognise their names or not, is a strong determinant of which discipline you live in and what community you belong to. And the language used to talk about excellent work is also a strong signal of these cultural elements. These aren't the genes themselves in the same way that bands on a gel or fluorescent signals in a DNA sequencer aren't the genes themselves either. But they're signals or proxies that we can use to tease apart and understand these elements of culture that we're studying. So culture creates groups in this model of cultural science through the gathering and reinforcing of community ties, through shared storytelling, which in turn recreates that culture. It's a cyclic process of reinforcement. Our obsession with winning, with being the top of the rankings, with excellence, however defined, both defines our community's self-identity and as part of the story we tell about what we're doing. We transmit that knowledge beyond our communities into the wider world. You will have heard these words. While the UK represents just 0.9% of the global population, 3.2% of R&D expenditure and 4.1% of researchers, it accounts for 9.5% of downloads, 11.6% of citations, and 15.9% of the world's most highly cited articles. This story that comes out of a report commissioned by the research councils and BIS from Scopus and Elsevier is a story which has worked its way very effectively from councils to BIS into the mouths of multiple science ministers. This is the story we tell ourselves about how we are, who we are. This concept of being at the top of excellence is, in a sense, a strong part of the shared perspective of what makes scholarship. And it's we who create this world in which everyone somehow has to be above average, in which we pursue this goal of focusing resources only on the best, despite the fact that if we actually achieved that, we would destroy our research capacity. If you only do the very best research, then you've got no foundations to build on. Our focus on excellence is both dangerous, that leads at best to building skyscrapers on sand, and at worst to the kind of performative, systematic self-deception and fraud that we see expanding in the words, certainly, of science. But it is also who we are in a very deep sense. I've been making this argument for a decade, and I still think in this week and last week, which discipline I might plausibly one day argue I've earned a Nobel Prize, or whether I should be pushing to get into the Royal Academy or the Royal Society. It's a real obsession with always being on top. So, cultural science is an evolutionary model, so it's concerned with which cultures and therefore which groups survive over time. That doesn't mean that the culture is static. It's not an atomistic theory of evolution in that sense, but then neither is biological evolution these days either. But it sees culture as dynamic, responsive to the group that's creating it, responsive to the environment in which it finds itself. And so as in any evolutionary theory, there are going to be stable strategies, stable combinations of cultural elements under given environmental conditions. And as in any evolutionary theory, if the environment changes, those stable strategies can be broken. So I would argue that our cultures of excellence grew up in an era when the research communities were really quite closed and quite small. Until perhaps the 1950s, I'm going to be vague because I know there are historians in the room, the key players in any given field probably knew each other. And then environmental factors shifted that. The expansion of institutions and universities, this is the number of students in higher education, year over the 20th century, meant that the interpersonal contact between researchers within a broad field became totally impossible. And the geographic expansion contributed to this as well. leading to the sort of involution, splitting and specialisation of disciplines. My guess would be that those groupings and communities stayed about the same size over time, but became smaller and smaller in scope, more and more specialised. And as that happened, any shared understanding of what was excellent research was lost. The shared cultural element was lost. But the need to describe our work and claim excellence became more and more important across those boundaries. The rhetoric of excellence remained critical even as the meaning fell away. So Arjun Abdurai, in his introductory chapter to The Social Life of Things, discusses how parallel markets in commodity objects, a local market where the value is tied to use, is therefore somehow connected, something rational, can operate in parallel with markets that are larger in scale, but where the actual connection to use value is lost, and that those markets get dominated and driven by the prestige associated with these values and the way in which prestige gets associated with exchange, handled with exchange. And at some level, I would argue that the market in excellence across disciplinary boundaries is in essence a knowledge-free market in the same way that futures commodities markets are, driven not by any connection with reality, but with a sense of what you can get away with and where you think the price might go. And proxies, most of them completely meaningless, had to arise to try and provide some way of cutting through this. The information of a journal impact factor or a university ranking or a citation count is pretty much comparable to the kind of magical thinking that you see in graph theory around futures markets or currency exchanges. But they feel this deep human need to tell this story about how we're better than anyone else and to predict the future. They function almost as some sort of cargo cult level evidence. We can drop into our shared rhetorical structure of evidence, built argument, while not actually qualifying as evidence in any of our disciplines. Because it's just not good enough, and nor is the analysis. So, at some level, that doesn't matter. We could still have a stable market. These secondary prestige markets and commodities markets and futures markets can be stable, even if there's no connection with value. They can function without price actually being connected to reality. And it's entirely possible that we could have managed this expansion into a stable and agreed way of handling excellence without necessarily having any shared meaning. Whether it would be a good thing or not is an entirely separate question, but it could have been an evolutionary stable strategy based on strong in-group understanding and community basis for what was excellent, with their own internal different definitions and some form of cross-disciplinary communication that was really based primarily on prestige and proxies rather than anything struck reality. That's at least a plausible argument for what might have happened, except the world changed. Disciplinary specialisation, the creation of new journals, new departments, new sub-departments, and combined with some sort of successful externalised measures of excellence, would drive, arguably did drive the consolidation of communities, a closing down, a hardening of the barriers. What's the first thing you want to do if you want to found a new discipline? Well, first you focus group the name, second you start the journal. You create a shared, closed space for that community to operate. That might have worked, but the internet and the web in particular just basically blew that up. For good or ill, the web transforms the economics of the geography of communication and publishing and the economics of interactions. Perhaps more importantly, it restructures the economics of which clubs and communities are viable. It makes more niche communities viable by making it much cheaper for them to discover and interact with each other. But doing that requires that the barriers not be there. It requires a degree of openness because otherwise the discovery aspect that reduces those costs costs of finding that one or two or three other people in the world who share your particular interest. The cost saving isn't there unless there's a degree of openness. And that's what's driven our increasing assumption that what is online is free to access, that information doesn't exist unless it's in Google. Michael Nielsen in Reinventing Discovery and Clay Shirky in Cognitive Surplus both examine the question of how this change in economics made it possible for small contributions to become very valuable, for a very particular kind of expertise in a very particular context to come to the right place at just the right time. So no longer is it necessary to be the deep expert, to be the person who Osborne feels should have done their 4 years of undergraduate history just to get in the door. If you're the right person with the right piece of knowledge at the right time, and you can contribute effectively. And massive economic and cultural value is being created daily by systems that take advantage of this. And that was what gave rise to this techno-utopian, socialist utopia, neoliberal view of markets and free exchange and commons, which I think it was John Wilbanks referred to as commonsism, a sort of market-based communitarian view of the world. But what had happened is that our communities, our scholarly communities, had turned inwards, seeking those internal consistencies, trying to understand what it was we shared within our groups about what was excellence, and looking for stability in a world which was changing really rapidly. And as you deepen and intensify those shared ties internally, you necessarily harden and fortify, in many cases, the boundaries where the web could actually bring you into contact with different conceptions and different ways of thinking. I don't think it's accidental that the disciplines that Michelle Lamont identifies in her book, How Professors Think, where she looks at the thought processes that people are bringing to research grant panels in social sciences and humanities in Canada, that she identifies history, Osborne's and Peter Mandler's discipline, as precisely that discipline with the most stable self-conception. Describes them as a community that's proud of, and I'm quoting, having prevented the threat posed by postmodernism from coming to fruition in history, because it demands adherence to a logic of scholarly inquiry shared by history scholars generally, by which the results of historical inquiry can be tested for their validity, very much as they are in other disciplines. It's not surprising to me that the discipline she identifies as having very strong ideas, very clear ideas about what is excellent work, is the same discipline in which there is the most scepticism, apparently, about the value that people from outside that community, outside that club, can make a contribution. So we're caught in this crosshairs between two different strategies, two different cultural and community approaches that grow in response to actually two different environmental changes. It's not self-evident to me which would be more successful and stable, or over what timeframes. And so to dissect that, we need to actually return back to an economic analysis with the focus on these communities and clubs that are interacting or not as they choose. So the economics of clubs is actually a well-studied area based on work done by Buchanan in the 60s and 70s, and I'm not even going to pretend to go through that work because I'm certainly not an expert in economics. But I do want to look at the kind of class of goods that are important in sustaining clubs and communities. I think that's a useful lens to use. Buchanan's work originally looked at things like sports clubs, clubs that have some sort of facilities that members can use. So these facilities are generally non-rivalrous. To a certain extent, we can both use the pool, but they're also excludable because you can lock the door to the pool and prevent non-members from having access. So that puts us firmly in the bottom right-hand corner of that quadrant diagram. So usually, I mucked up my punchline. The slides. Usually that quadrant is referred to as toll goods. We often put subscription journals in that space, or a paid-for database or something like that. They're also called club goods because they are the kinds of goods that tend to sustain clubs. They are membership benefits. A subscription journal is in that sense a club, a membership club where the member benefit is access to the content in the journal. But what about our other knowledge clubs, our disciplines, our communities? What actually sustains them? So, in many cases, it's obviously money, in one sort or another. Research groups depend on salaries, they depend on grants. Open access journals rely on money from consortia or from APCs, or they get money indirectly through contributed time and contributed platforms. Databases receive grants or charge subscriptions, or they're sustained by foundation members that look after them. That money is exchanged for something, invested in the creation of something. And so the central claim I want to make is that the core good, the central good that is sustaining these clubs, that is the value created by these knowledge clubs, disciplinary clubs, journals, databases, is knowledge. That knowledge is always created in and communicated through clubs, research groups, departments, journals, databases. But if that's true, then how is it possible that knowledge can be exchanged for money or prestige or other things that might plausibly become goods, if it's a public good? Because by definition, a public good is something that requires external, global provision because of its freeloader. So the answer, of course, lies in the question. Knowledge is not a public good. It's a club good. Knowledge as it is created is clearly excludable, if by no other means than not telling anybody else about it. Through communication and dissemination, we make it less exclusive. We share ideas with a colleague, we speak at a conference, we might publish an article, we might publish it in an open access venue, we might write a lay summary, we might undertake engagement activities. But we can never entirely eliminate exclusion. We can only invest in reducing it. Now, that may seem depressing, because it's an acceptance that we can never make knowledge as free as we might like to. But I think it's also liberating. It identifies openness as a process or a practice, not a binary state of an object, which is either yes or no. It's something to work towards rather than blaming ourselves for failing to achieve it. And it recenters the question of how best to invest limited resources in making things more open and more public and less exclusive. Which audiences should we target? How best to enable unexpected contributions? How to maximise the network benefits that arise from making things open? And I'm not, incidentally, in focusing on this more fuzzy process thing, stepping away at all from the position I've long held on best practices in licensing and other things around open access. In fact, I think it actually strengthens that position. Open licensing, once you've decided to invest in making a piece of content freely available, certainly a research article free to read, it enhances discoverability and reusable at essentially no additional cost and with essentially no financial downside. But it does open a road for making a case where it might not be the right choice, a sensible case, a difficult one to prove because you'd have to be able to assess the true costs of making something open versus slightly restricted and the true benefits that you're giving up, basically. But nonetheless a case that you could analyse. So in this model, clubs create or refine, curate, present knowledge in the context of their own culture. Knowledge can circulate within the club as a club good, as a benefit of membership. Prestige accrues to those within the club whose contribution is viewed internally as excellent. And this drives an internal symbolic economy of prestige, as Martin Eve talks about in his book, Open Access and the Humanities. And that's fine, but that internal economy might be enough to sustain the club. It could be for a small scholarly society, for instance, where the journal of the society is a membership benefit, where the members publish in that journal more or less exclusively. But it doesn't bring in external resources. It doesn't bring in additional money, additional prestige from outside the club. And that is generally required for a viable research group, a viable discipline. So to interact beyond those borders, clubs also trade knowledge for prestige, and then for money in the form of grants and salaries. But here that knowledge trade is associated with claims of excellence, often associated with the name of the journal or its impact factor, or the name of the publisher if we're talking about a scholarly monograph. But that claim is generally completely empty of meaning. It means nothing to you for me to say I published an article in Nature. It doesn't tell you anything about how important that work is. It allows me to make a claim about its excellence that we can trade, and that may in fact be important for me to get a job, but it doesn't actually tell you anything about the value of the work. So again, our traditional thinking would be to harden the boundaries and hence enhance the sense of exclusivity of bringing in the club, which is in tension or direct opposition to the possibility of bringing in new interactions, finding new ways to bring in new goods to the club. So we return again to this question of which strategy is more stable. Defining and closing borders, or in some yet to be defined way, creating opportunities for interactions. What we've added is an understanding that these openings can be created by investing in making knowledge less clubbish and more public. And then we can layer on top of this the cultural science perspective that these openings aim to create interactions with new clubs. And that those clubs that are most open to interaction will be those with the most strongly shared cultural elements. So, where does this leave us? So I've asserted that knowledge is a club good. That scholarly communication is basically a series of efforts at different levels to try and make knowledge less exclusive. I think the new insight is that this process is engineered to return new club goods back to the group, primarily prestige, but also the facilities and resources that make further research possible. If we're to shift the balance so that clubs make knowledge more public and less exclusive, we need to identify what club goods they are getting in return, and we need to understand how the incentives are created to provide the systems that support this public making, literally publishing, of knowledge. So the scaling problem of the mid to late 20th century was addressed through taking club goods and privatising them, corporatising the management process as a way of managing the scaling problem, because clubs can only operate at a certain scale. Copyright in the scholarly world, the whole apparatus that surrounds scholarly content as a private asset, the access barriers, subscription systems, all of this was essentially invented from the 1950s onwards. And that now sits as private capital, largely in the hands of, though very unevenly spread, between traditional scholarly publishers. And that's not actually all bad. That capital is what actually made it possible to move the world of scholarly communications online from the mid-90s in what is, in retrospect, a remarkably short period of time. So that was the solution for the second half of the 20th century, but today we have new options to manage that scaling problem. The change in the economics of club formation, discovery and cost of communication actually provide us with new models, and we're starting to see those. Co-ops and consortia emerging, Open Library of Humanities, Knowledge Unlatched, membership models that look more club-like, like Piaget, and cooperative support mechanisms like Scope 3 in physics and the archive support community. But each of these is relatively small, and it's an important point. Governance and management challenges arise when group sizes grow beyond the set of people who can sit around a table. And things break as that group size grows on that point. Even at Piaget, which has a lot of editors and starting to handle quite a lot of papers, Pete Binfield actually personally touches every single article, is in contact with every single author. The human contact creates the sense of community and that sense of club. Scope 3 works in physics because you can basically get the big particle physics communities and facilities around a table in a way that you can't get all the departments of history or all the departments of chemistry in the universities in the world around a table. So it's the web that's changed the systematic economics in a way that makes these groups viable, potentially. To allow them to grow, we need to learn that lesson, and we need to build new shared infrastructures that continue to drive that cost down while connecting these clubs up in different ways. We need infrastructures that drive discovery and interaction, but also at some level that make those cultures more interoperable. These infrastructures will have politics, all tools have politics. And if we design them well, that will be a politics of openness and porous borders that encourages community interaction, community building, and intersection. We need to actually architect our disciplinary cultures so as to find a balance between identity and internal conceptions of excellence that drive that internal competition that is part of what makes us researchers at some level. And balance that with openness to contributions from the outside. We can define two kinds of extremes on this scale. One in which a discipline's self-conception is incoherent and therefore, in a sense, too open to contribution or movement or change from the outside. Lamont diagnoses anthropology as one discipline that might be suffering from this. I might, not particularly safe in this audience, perhaps point to the turmoil in library science and information studies, continually asking what it is that the discipline is or is for, and how that plays out. But other disciplines are too stable, too well-defined, and too closed. Lamont points to history and philosophy. I might point personally to synthetic chemistry. Disciplines where the coherence runs the risk of becoming stasis, isolation, complete incomprehension across those disciplinary boundaries. And those disciplines are at risk. They cost money to run, and if people don't recognise what in them is excellent, if people aren't working across those borders, then they will stop being funded at some level. So somewhere between these extremes is a space where shared culture and shared identity is strong enough. And a shared understanding of excellence is coherent enough, but where new contributions and new perspectives can be welcomed and integrated. So we can imagine a world where knowledge clubs come together through partially shared conceptions of excellence and culture, but where those overlaps and lack of overlaps are actually understood and productive channels for exchange and communication are clear, and what will be a non-productive conversation to have might also be clear. Of course, this conception isn't restricted to interdisciplinary interactions. It might also form as a productive model for deciding how and where to invest in public engagement, how to talk productively to other stakeholders like funders and institutions and publishers in our space, and how to get beyond the points of mutual incomprehension that often characterise those conversations. To achieve that, though, if we want to think of this multi-centred model with overlapping communities, we're going to have to reconsider excellence. I've described an argument where there's a prestige economy which is built on this sharp separation of the amount of knowledge available to the internal community in terms of judgments, and an essentially knowledge-free exchange value market across these communities. If we're going to take these clubs and wire them into some form of network, to borrow Nick Sousa's words, we need to add meaning back to shared conceptions of excellence or overlap in each of these specific contexts where each of these different communities are coming into contact. We need to focus on the elements of overlap, differing qualities, plural, not quality, that are unique in each of these different contexts. If we want to embed the desire to find and use these overlaps amongst communities, we need to move our way away from our obsession with linear rankings. We'd have to actually abandon the rhetoric of excellence, and in short, we'd actually have to re-engineer our shared culture. So I started with the observation that changing culture is hard. And I finished with a call for cultural change. But I've tried to create a frame in which I think it's easier to imagine how we can affect that cultural change than it might otherwise be. So first, Through adopting this concept of cultural science and seeing culture as an evolutionary competitive process, we can look to those communities that are already adapting most effectively and ask how their cultures can be sustained, enhanced, transmitted. Bioinformatics, the digital humanities, some areas of literature studies. Using that economic framing of goods, we can also enhance the club goods that those communities are receiving. We can stick our fingers on the balance to enhance the survivability of those communities that are already doing well. Second, by looking at clubs as created by and co-creating their culture and using the language and the rhetoric that they use as symbols or signals of those cultural elements, we can directly intervene through our use of language. We can consciously create and reshape our cultures in the ways we want to see. Qualities, not quality. Rhetorics of excellence. Publics. The usual humanities thing of just pluralising everything. But even the tone of voice and the kind of the visible held nose as you talk about impact factors or university rankings sends a message. Stories we tell ourselves make our culture. So choosing to act consciously through the language we use is a very powerful way to change our cultures. And finally, if we adopt this evolutionary frame, we can recognise that we have the ability to shape the environment. Building platforms, infrastructures that tip the balance towards discoverability and interactions and openness will naturally reshape the investment choices that these knowledge clubs are making. Shared information systems aid governance and they allow clubs and those governance systems to scale up. Platforms that are both general and flexible could completely reshape the economics of scholarly publishing, and that's just as a starting point. We can build it and they will come if we focus on tools that support existing viable communities and not build for the imaginary communities that we wish existed. So I spent a lot of the last decade worrying mainly about incentives for individuals, carrots and sticks, mandates, citation advantages. But even with these in place, the cultures of disciplines has seemed to be a blocker. I believe that by focusing our attention on communities, groups and clubs and the incentives at the club level, we're going to make more progress, because at some level the incentives for the club are the culture. So there are limits to openness, and we can never completely remove exclusion. But we can choose to invest time and effort and resources thoughtfully in dropping those barriers where we can. And in doing so, we can choose to maximise the benefits that the network scales bring. A challenge is to construct the world in which we approach that limit in the mathematical sense as quickly and as early as possible.